I once believed nothing could break through the Atlantic wall. But that morning, when I raised my binoculars, the sea itself had changed. It shimmered, dark and endless, a city of steel rising from the mist. In that instant, before a single shot was fired, I understood what no one in Berlin yet dared to admit. Germany had already lost. My name is Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, 352nd Artillery Regiment, posted on the coast of Normandy. For months my world had been reduced to concrete, wind, and the colour grey. Every morning began the same, the dull hum of the sea beyond the mist, the salt biting at my lips, the chill creeping through the cracks of the bunker walls. The Atlantic stretched out before us, an endless, indifferent expanse. We told ourselves it was our shield, our moat, our fortress. In truth, it was only silence, wide, cold, and waiting. Inside the bunker, life followed the rhythm of repetition. We cleaned the guns, calibrated the rangefinders, drilled again and again until our movements felt mechanical. Each man knew his position so well he could perform it blindfolded. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. We measured time not by calendars, but by the erosion of metal under salt air. The propaganda posters called this line of fortifications the Atlantic Wall, a wall of iron and concrete that would turn back any invasion. The officers from Berlin spoke of it as if it were a monument to destiny itself. But I had seen its cracks, the unfinished gun pits, the rusted hinges, the soft sandbags that crumbled under our boots. I knew the difference between the promise of steel and the reality of mortar. It wasn't a wall, it was faith poured into concrete, and faith, I had learned, could break just as easily. Sometimes at night, when the fog swallowed the sea and the wind moaned through the firing slits, I could almost hear the ghosts of the Eastern Front, the sound of tanks in snow, of men shouting in Russian. I had come here to rest, they said, after the hell of Kharkov. Yet rest had its own torment. Waiting can be crueler than battle. We waited for an enemy we could not see, for a day that might never come. And still, beneath the monotony, something stirred. A quiet unease, a sense that the sea itself was holding its breath. Even before the first ship appeared, I felt it. The war was moving toward us, carried on the wind. They called it Fortress Europe. From the fjords of Norway to the shores of Spain, the Reich promised an unbroken wall of steel and concrete, a barrier that would hold back the combined might of the world. Every broadcast, every poster, every speech from Berlin spoke of invincibility. I had believed it once, or at least wanted to. But here in Normandy, the truth was impossible to ignore. The bunkers were uneven, many still incomplete, their concrete rough where the formwork had been pulled too soon. Some gun pits had no guns, only empty mounts that waited for deliveries that never came. The minefields were patchy, some sections bare because the engineers had run out of mines. The Great Atlantic Wall was less a wall and more a series of scattered scars along the coastline. Even the air smelled of decay, salt, rust, and oil. Our guns, the proud symbols of German precision, were already corroding. We oiled them daily, but the dampness crept in like a disease. The men under my command were a reflection of the Reich itself, fragmented. There were veterans from the Eastern Front, their eyes hollow from too many winters in Russia, their discipline brittle. Then there were boys barely 17, who still blushed when spoken to by an officer. And there were the older reservists, fathers and shopkeepers, whose hands trembled when they handled shells heavier than their children. Together we were supposed to hold back an empire. I followed my orders, of course. We trained, we drilled, we measured ranges until the numbers blurred. Yet even as I corrected their stances and barked commands, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that all this preparation was for a storm we could not truly stop. We were building confidence, not defences. Every evening, as the sun bled into the grey sea, I watched the water and wondered if the enemy was already out there, beyond the horizon, gathering strength. Berlin called it Fortress Europe. But I knew better. It was not a fortress. It was a stage set built to convince us that faith could hold back the tide. The waiting was the hardest part. Night after night, the same darkness pressed down, thick and endless, the sea whispering against the shore like something alive. We called it Tag X, the Day X, half as a joke, half as a superstition. The younger soldiers turned it into a betting game. Who could guess when the invasion would finally come, where the Allies would land? The older men never joined in. They had seen too many predictions dissolve under artillery fire. Each sunrise that came without alarm felt like a small reprieve from fate. The generals in Paris and Berlin were certain of one thing. When the Allies came, they would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing, the most logical choice. Maps, reports, even aerial photographs confirmed it, they said. It was the kind of logic that made too much sense to be questioned. Yet I couldn't ignore the quiet unease that came with every calm morning. Logic had killed more soldiers than bullets. I had learned that on the Eastern Front where nothing ever happened the way it was supposed to. What we didn't know then was that the enemy had already invaded our minds. They called it Operation Fortitude, though we wouldn't learn the name until long after the war. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, false headquarters, even a phantom general named Patton, all designed to make us stare at Calais while they gathered in the shadows elsewhere. And it worked. We looked, but we didn't see. Our own need to believe in certainty blinded us. Rommel understood, or at least tried to. When he visited the coast, he was restless, prowling from bunker to bunker, shouting for more mines, more obstacles, more urgency. He told us plainly, if they reach the beaches, the war is lost. But his warnings travelled upward into a fog of arrogance and complacency. In Berlin, they still spoke of victory. Here, we spoke of weather. We checked the tides, studied clouds, listened to the wind as if it could tell us what the enemy was planning. The truth was simpler and crueler. We were waiting for a storm we could neither predict nor survive. And the worst part was, we didn't know we were being deceived because we wanted so desperately to believe the lie. June 5th, 1944. The storm arrived just as the meteorologists had promised. Angry, relentless, and absolute. The wind howled like artillery across the cliffs, tearing at the tarps and rattling every loose hinge in the bunker. Waves slammed into the shoreline hard enough to make the concrete tremble. We sealed the firing ports and waited it out, listening to the roar of nature at war with itself. The rain came in sheets, thick and cold, turning the trenches into rivers. It felt as though the sea was trying to reclaim the land. By midnight, every man in the bunker was soaked, tired, and strangely relieved. The storm, we thought, had saved us again. The German Meteorological Office confirmed what we all wanted to hear. Conditions were impossible for any invasion. The English Channel was impassable, they said. Too rough, too unpredictable. The radio carried the news like a lullaby. You could feel the tension ease in every man's shoulders. Some even laughed for the first time in weeks. The officers spoke in low voices about leave requests, supply runs, the dull rhythm of normality. Even Field Marshal Rommel, the man who had warned that the war in the West would be lost in a single day, had left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. That alone said everything. If Rommel was gone, there would be no invasion. The storm was our ally now. After midnight, the winds began to fade. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the sea still restless but quieter, as if exhausted by its own rage. I stepped outside for the first time in hours. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of salt and wet earth. The horizon was invisible, swallowed by mist. No lights, no engines, no movement, only the steady hiss of water retreating from the shore. It was beautiful in a way, too beautiful, the kind of calm that only comes after something breaks. I stood there, my boots sinking into the soaked soil, listening to the silence. Around me the bunker slept. The men were at peace, the guns at rest, the world seemingly still. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was not safety, but suspension, like the held breath before a scream. I didn't know then if I was standing inside peace, or at the edge of the abyss. It was just after 5 in the morning when the fog began to thin. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting the lungs. I stood at the bunker's observation slit, the metal of my Zeiss binoculars biting against my fingers. The sea looked the same as always, grey, indifferent, endless. Then I saw it, a faint line, almost invisible at first, just where the sea met the sky. I blinked, thinking it might be the shadow of a cloud or the trick of tired eyes after another sleepless night. But it didn't fade. It grew. Slowly, steadily. The line thickened, darkened, and began to spread across the horizon. I adjusted the focus. My heart was beating faster now, though I didn't know why. The shape was too straight, too deliberate. It wasn't weather. It wasn't the tide. I felt my breath shorten as new shapes began to emerge behind it. Tiny dots at first, multiplying until they blurred into one another, forming a moving wall of shadow. My hands trembled slightly. The binoculars slipped against my gloves. The stillness of the morning made it worse. No wind, no birds, only the low hiss of the surf and the pounding in my chest. For a moment I thought my mind was inventing things. I lowered the binoculars. The horizon seemed unchanged, calm, innocent. But when I raised them again, the truth struck me like a blow. The dark line wasn't one object, it was many, countless. It was movement, ships, dozens, no hundreds of them. Their outlines were faint but unmistakable, black against the soft glow of dawn. They were coming. The sea, once empty, was filling before my eyes. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. The binoculars fogged with my breath as I counted, lost count, and started again. My pulse thudded so loud it drowned out the ocean. Behind the first line, more appeared, spreading like ink through water. I felt the cold crawl up my spine as realization took shape. The horizon wasn't holding still anymore. It was moving, alive, advancing. The fog lifted just enough for the light to catch the steel of their hulls, glinting like teeth. I whispered to myself, though no one could hear, "It's not the tide that's rising. It's the world itself coming for us." I grabbed the field telephone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and barked into the receiver. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. There are thousands of ships on the channel." For a moment I heard nothing but the scratch of static and the distant crash of surf. Then a voice came back, flat and calm, as if reading from a weather report. "You're mistaken, Lieutenant. Conditions are not suitable for an invasion." I felt my mouth go dry. "I'm looking at them with my own eyes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There are landing craft, transports, lines of ships as far as I can see." The reply was polite disbelief. "Our intelligence and reports indicate no major fleet movement. Stand by." I could hear the skepticism hiding in the careful words. It was as if maps and telegrams had more claim to truth than the men who lived and breathed the coast. I switched lines, calling regimental headquarters. "Sir, this is Richter. There is a fleet on the channel. They are coming." The Major's answer was slow, measured. "Is your observation confirmed? The weather reports contradict you." My patience frayed. I could feel every second stretching like a taut wire. "For God's sake, look at the sea!" I shouted, and for an instant the telephone seemed to eat my words. On the other end there was a pause, a muffled rustle, then the same refrain of disbelief. Orders to verify, reports to file, the machinery of command grinding in its accustomed rhythm. It was surreal. Here I was, speaking from the mouth of the enemy, and the men in the chain of command preferred the comfort of paperwork to the clarity of sight. The bunker hummed around me, men peering out, rangefinders clicking, the smell of oil and sweat. While above that mechanical calm, my own inner voice was rising to a kind of panic. If they would not accept what my eyes told them, then I had to force the world to listen in a language they could not ignore. I pulled the lanyard, signalled the gun crews, and with a hardness I had not felt since the Eastern Front, I said, "Prepare to fire." If no one would believe my words, then they would believe the thunder of our guns. "Fire!" The word tore from my throat before the echo of disbelief in my head could stop it. A second later the bunker shook to life. The first cannon thundered, a sound so deep it seemed to split the air itself. Dust rained from the ceiling, the floor trembled, and the shock wave punched through my chest. The next gun fired, then another, until the world became a single rolling roar. Through the observation slit I tracked the shells arcing toward the horizon. Thin streaks of fire slicing across the morning sky. For a moment there was only silence, the long, terrible pause before impact. Then columns of water erupted amid the ships. Too short, too far, but the rhythm began. Adjust, fire, adjust, fire again. My voice was hoarse from shouting coordinates, my ears ringing with the metallic symphony of war. Then I saw it, a flash, a plume of smoke, a bright wound on the water's surface. A destroyer staggered, turning sharply. Someone shouted, "Hit! Direct hit!" It was the USS Corey, though we didn't know the name then. Whether our shell struck true or it found a mine hardly mattered. To us, it was victory. The men cheered, their fear dissolving into sudden, reckless pride. In that instant, the impossible felt possible again. For the first time that morning, I believed we might hold. But the illusion lasted only seconds. I raised my binoculars again. The destroyer was burning, but behind it the sea remained full, endless, alive. Where one ship faltered, 100 more surged forward. The formation didn't scatter. It didn't even slow. The gap closed as though the wounded vessel had never existed. My men shouted, loaded, fired again. Shells exploded across the channel, yet the fleet advanced with mechanical indifference, as if our barrage were nothing more than rain. Sweat and powder smoke stung my eyes. I tasted salt, perhaps from the sea, perhaps from my own skin. The guns roared, but the sound now felt small, almost human, against the noise of engines that filled the horizon. I remember thinking, not with anger, but with a strange calm clarity. We had just thrown a stone at the ocean, and it hadn't even made a ripple. The sea answered. It didn't roar, it detonated. The first flashes came from beyond the horizon, bright and silent for an instant before the thunder reached us. The sky went white, then orange, then black again. A heartbeat later, the ground convulsed. The shockwave hit the bunker like a hammer, dust exploding from the ceiling, instruments crashing to the floor. Every sense blurred. Sound, light, motion. All became one overwhelming vibration. Outside, the Atlantic itself seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the guns. We had fired first, but now the ocean was speaking the language of industry. It wasn't a duel, it was demolition. The shells came in patterns, precise, methodical, unending. They weren't aiming for us, they were erasing us. One salvo after another tore through the coastline, reducing gun positions we had spent months building into dust in seconds. Through the observation slit I saw geysers of mud and steel erupt where our batteries had stood. Men screamed into phones that no longer worked. The air stank of ozone and shattered rock. I remember thinking, they're not firing back. They're clearing the coast like a factory conveyor. Above the chaos, I searched the sky for any sign of our own air force. Nothing. No friendly engines, no black crosses, only the constant growl of Allied bombers circling overhead like vultures. Somewhere inland, the 21st Panzer Division was supposed to be preparing a counterattack, but they were paralysed, waiting for permission that had to crawl its way up to Hitler's headquarters and back again. Orders moved slower than the shells that were killing us. And the Luftwaffe, once our pride, was invisible, grounded by fuel shortages and fear. I understood then that this wasn't about bravery or tactics. The Allies weren't fighting a battle, they were executing a system. Every explosion was part of a process, efficient, unrelenting, perfect. We weren't being outgunned, we were being outproduced. The bunker shook again, a deep rumble that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. I gripped the cold steel of the observation slit, watching the horizon burn. The Atlantic wall, our fortress of faith, was being dismantled piece by piece, not by courage, but by machinery. The air inside the bunker was thick with dust and smoke, but through the haze my mind began to see more clearly than ever before. Each explosion outside seemed to peel away another layer of illusion. I no longer saw ships and shells, I saw factories. Every thunderclap on the horizon became the echo of a hammer in Detroit. In my mind's eye I could picture assembly lines stretching beyond sight, workers in overalls welding steel, machines stamping out the future one rivet at a time. It wasn't the fleet that terrified me, it was the machinery behind it. This war had never been about courage or will, it was about production. We had been taught to believe in German precision, in the strength of a single Tiger tank, the perfection of an engineered masterpiece. But what did precision matter when the enemy could build dozens while we built one? In 1944, America alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly output had never reached 2,000, and in the sky, the imbalance was monstrous. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe had managed barely 300 sorties across all of France, while the Allies flew over 14,000. For every German plane, there were 40 Allied ones. I thought of our proud slogans, "Willpower conquers steel." What a cruel joke that had become. Willpower could not fill fuel tanks. Willpower could not build airplanes. Willpower could not stop the conveyor belt of an entire continent's industry. I pressed my palms to my ears as another shell landed nearby, not to block the sound, but because I couldn't bear to hear the truth screaming through the walls. We had lost this war not on the beaches, but in the factories, long before the first soldier set foot on Normandy. The realization settled over me like the dust in the air, heavy and inescapable. We had poured our faith into myth, into machines too perfect to mass produce, into arrogance disguised as engineering. The Allies had built something else entirely: time, momentum, and inevitability. We had the tiger, beautiful, lethal, rare. They had time, endless, tireless, merciless. And time, I realized, was what had killed us long before this morning began. The wall broke, not in silence, but in thunder. One shell landed close enough to lift the bunker from its foundations. I hit the concrete floor hard, the world flashing white for a heartbeat. When my hearing returned, it was chaos. The phone lines were dead, the switchboard sparked uselessly. Smoke filled the command post, choking and blinding. Someone was shouting orders, but the words vanished under the roar of artillery. Through the observation slit I saw the Atlantic itself bleeding. The sea was no longer grey, it had turned red. The first Higgins boats were already dropping their ramps, spilling men into the surf. They waded forward through waves that came up to their chests, rifles held high, bodies pushed by the tide. Machine guns along the beach opened up, cutting through the ranks, but more kept coming, an unending procession of shapes moving through the mist. For every man who fell, two more took his place. Behind them, Allied destroyers broke formation, driving straight toward the shore, their hulls scraping sandbars. They fired point blank into our bunkers, each blast a hammer blow against the dying wall. The sky trembled with the sound. I could see WW amphibious trucks crawling out of the surf like impossible creatures, followed by strange tanks with spinning flails, the infamous Hobart's funnies. They weren't just crossing the sea, they were crossing the boundaries of imagination. Our own tanks were nowhere. Our guns, one by one, went silent. A direct hit shattered the gun emplacement beside me. When the dust cleared, the men who had stood there were gone. Only fragments remained. I wiped grime from my eyes and stared at the sight below. The shoreline crawling with life, with metal, with inevitability. The Atlantic wall was not collapsing. It was being consumed, layer by layer, under an avalanche of invention. I had thought myself a soldier defending ground. But in that moment, I realized we weren't defending anything at all. We were witnesses to the moment when human will met industrial power, and lost. As another shell exploded above, showering the bunker in sparks and dust, I whispered the truth I could no longer deny. They didn't just cross the sea, they crossed the limits of what I thought was possible. By mid-morning, it was over. The 352nd Division, the proud guardians of Normandy, was gone. More than 1/200 of our men lay silent amid the wreckage, scattered across trenches and shattered bunkers. The beach that had once been ours now belonged to the invaders, though by then invader no longer felt like the right word. They weren't raiders or armies in the old sense, they were a force of production, a tide made of steel, fuel and mathematics. I survived by accident, pulled from the rubble of what had been our observation post. My ears rang endlessly, a thin, high whistle that erased all other sound. The world had become slow and distant, as if viewed through water. Smoke stung my eyes, and when I wiped it away I saw the sea again. It was filled, not just with ships, but with motion. Landing craft came and went, trucks rolled off ramps. Men carried crates, cranes lifted steel. The horizon itself was alive, turning, moving, feeding. It was not an army anymore. It was a machine that had learned to breathe. Around me, everything that had once felt eternal was broken. The guns, the walls, even the idea of Germany. The truth of that morning was not written in glory or courage, but in numbers, in output, in the mechanical rhythm of dominance. For every tank we destroyed, 3 took its place. For every soldier we killed, 10 more came ashore. The Allies landed 1,500 tanks that day alone, an impossible number that mocked everything we'd been taught to believe about balance and strategy. I remember staring at that endless procession of ships and men and thinking how quiet it all seemed now, how inevitable. The noise of battle had faded, but its meaning lingered, the end of an idea. We had built a wall out of concrete, proud, unyielding, meant to last 1,000 years, but they had built a bridge out of steel, flexible, relentless, and alive. That morning I understood what few in Berlin ever would. The war didn't end in Berlin's ruins or Hitler's bunker. It ended here, on this beach, in the first light of dawn. We built a wall of concrete. They built a bridge of steel, and that morning I was the first to watch the wall fall.